This next session is an interesting one to me because this is something at Microsoft we were always addressing and dealing with was remote control management strategies for a global video workforce. So if you've got a campus, if you have teams that are elsewhere, it's not just about Zoom and Teams anymore, it's how do we bring them into our contribution broadcast. So panel, take it over.
Good morning. Thanks, everybody, for piling back in. I know there's a lot of fun out there in the hallway, but we're going to have a good conversation here for the next 30 minutes. My name is Mark Yoder. I am a production ops lead for Accenture Productions. We run a global team focused on video broadcasting, streaming, content creation, and those kinds of things. We run a network of studios, yada, yada, yada. We've got a great panel here. We're going to get right into things. We'll do intros and bios along the way real quick. We want to define what remote control means, and I think that means probably something different to everybody in the room. So just to kind of set a definition, that it could include people working from home, but in my case, it's globally distributed teams, right? People that are working in offices, working across locations and supporting live events together from multiple geographies. And so we're going to touch on a number of things, controlling consistency and quality, brand compliance. We're going to talk about maneuvering big last-minute projects, and we're going to introduce, how you introduce new technology while keeping the lights on. So you will notice that Cleave is not with us right now. If he does pop into the building, we'll try and get him up here. Let's start here with Erin McMullen, Bromley from Fox Sports. Erin, you've got a really interesting job from my perspective, and I think it does something for us that we should all be aware of. Traditional broadcasters and corporate broadcasters or content producers have a lot in common. You manage a supplier group of almost 200 suppliers that provide content for Fox Sports. That gives me night sweats. I worry for you. A team of 2 people, that seems like, and from my perspective, we do a ton of volume. And how do you manage that with just a nimble 2-person team? And anything you can share with us about how you make that work seamlessly will be super helpful.
Well, thank you. I don't know if I would call it seamless, but we have a pretty good on-air product. In the 200 suppliers, these are for broadcast materials. These aren't clips. This is not footage. This is stuff that's being delivered and ingested and goes to air rather quickly and re-airs and gets distributed on nonlinear platforms. So how we do it, we have a spec sheet, we have processes, we have guidelines, and we have great relationships with our suppliers. So we don't assume anything. We have a really strong onboarding process, and we have a system of checks and balances just like everyone else does.
Does each program feel a little bit different, or you're really focused on trying to have a consistent product that meets Fox's brand guidelines? How do you manage those changes? From where I come from in a corporate world, each managing director, each business unit wants something fresh. They want something new. How do you manage those expectations?
So each supplier and show is important. You heard from Mike Davis earlier on. He works on the big shows. We work on the less big shows, but we treat them with just as much care as we would our top tier partners. So as far as your original question was, how do you
manage those expectations, or what you're going to get, the quality, having control over your product when it's out of your hands?
It's the customized onboarding process. So every league is based in a different place, has different resources. Some of our people are one-man shows, so you would onboard them differently than you would an MLB partner or a large partner that has a broadcast facility. So customizing the onboarding and the workflow, but integrating them into the Fox processes and the things that need to happen to get a show to air.
Right. Chris, let's turn to you for a minute here. You were a former head of studios at YouTube and Spotify, and I think when we discussed or talked previously, you've really got an expertise in design and building but working on production workflows. And the one comment that you said that really stuck out to me was streamlining and simplifying approaches in terms of giving people, our creatives, exactly the tools they need, making the process simple for them to get their work done while enabling their creativity.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge, right? Is we're all here to enable, the best creative product that we can. And, initially, if we would have talked in the past, that's always been a technology conversation on our side of it. How do you move content around? How are you managing content? But it's really now, the technology is pretty sorted. So it's really about people and process and making sure that wherever you are, we had 50 different studios around the world with several different production entities that all needed to deliver extremely different types of media. Some are music, some are podcasts, some are video. And you want them to be as free and as able to deliver their creative product as best they can. So what you have to do, if technology is not the problem and their creativity is not the problem, the challenge becomes, how is that working? And how are you getting all of that content back to home base or distributed back out in a way that is so simple and so elegant that everybody is going to kind of abide by it? Because what I think probably everybody in this room would agree is that the more creative people you have, the more different styles of production you have, and the more kind of idiosyncratic ways of working. And when you put that on top of this idea that people are not all coming up through the same schools anymore. It used to be back in the day, we all had the exact same production training. We were all used to the same workflow. It was done in the same fashion for many, many years. And now you have, some people are coming out of social video, some people are coming out of podcasts, some people are coming out of music, some people are traditional film school grads. And you have to be able to accommodate all of that. And the best way to do that is to just simplify as few tools as possible, covering as much as possible, and being as flexible as possible.
Which I think is an interesting point. So, Erin, when we were talking a couple weeks ago, you asked the question, is there too much technology? Where are you at on that question? Is it a valid point? How do you simplify in your role?
Maybe we do have too much technology. I think we do make it a little more complicated than it needs to be, but I work every day to try to simplify it and improve the education process and the actual processes themselves. So yeah, it's not as simple today as hopefully it is tomorrow.
Yeah, and Dan, does that turn your stomach as the Chief Technology Officer at LiveU?
No, I think, a goal for a vendor like us is always to have the technology somewhat go into the background. We want it to be easy enough to use. We want it to be interoperable. We want it to work in the larger media ecosystem. So we don't like when somebody feels like it's complicated or it's a struggle to integrate, right? But we want that technology to obviously help them make their lives better and improve it. And we are always looking for ways to leverage more technology to do that. We just hopefully aren't making things worse rather than making things better when we go that direction.
For sure. Cleave, hi.
Made it.
Good to see you. It's on. It should be on for you.
Hello? Yep.
Hi. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here with us today. You're with SalesForce, broadcast video producer, corporate storyteller, right? Tell us a little bit about, in previous roles, you've managed teams that are global in nature, multiple geographic locations, whether we're talking Europe and North America, but tell us how you manage collaboration with your teams, whether that's on an individual project or at scale across a team.
So in previous roles, we were using, a lot of the social media tools that we have now, messaging, FaceTime, Google Meet, to sort of, create some kind of collegial collaboration. At SalesForce, we're using Slack, and I have to admit I wasn't a believer in the beginning, but it's a super powerful tool to keep groups together and just to create some kind of connection between teams. It's been sort of a big facilitator in getting folks, on the same page and seeing, people face to face and communicating and getting on, creating some trust.
Yeah. We've really focused on that with my team. We've got, between the engineering and the production team, about 140 people, and that's been something we're trying to just nurture. And honestly, you made this point, Chris, at one point, where do managers need to get out of the way? And the approach I've tried to take in letting people collaborate, we started just a simple Teams channel, and we just call it shout-outs. People get in there, share something that they're proud of, something that they've worked on. It's a lot of attaboys, but from my perspective, that's okay, right? Like, we want our team in India to be as recognized as our team in Chicago, and there's a different workflow or a different pipeline of events, and so we just let it be organic.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important, because as technology has solved all of these problems, right? So the conversation used to be, how are we going to make this happen? How do we even allow people to talk to each other? But now that all that technology is in place, it's really about people and process, right? So processes, you have to be open, you have to be flexible, you have to be able to design workflows that work for all the teams, as I said. But being, that ability to bring all the teams together and have a place where they can all talk as if they were all in one place, especially post-COVID, like we really learned this during COVID, it does hurt the team when they're all kind of segregated, and it's geographically. And then you obviously are always going to have the problem of time zones, but those type of empowering technologies and seeding those community places is incredibly important. And as a manager, I think the original question was like, where do we need to get out of the way? And managers always need to get out of the way, right? The key is to understand enough about what everybody is trying to do individually, so that the process and the people that you're putting in place really speak to and really conform to that kind of diverse nature of content delivery without getting in the way. And that's a tough balance to find.
I completely agree with it, though. And you're right, it is a tough balance to find. It's something that I'm trying to achieve as a producer, or as a person that came up as a producer. My phone was the first to ring every time there was a problem, from a news director, from a general manager, whoever it was. So
that'll always be the case.
It will always be the case. I've just come to accept it. But how do I let go of that a little bit? Let creatives do their thing. How do we just give people the space to operate, to be creative and unique and produce something compelling?
Well, I mean, you have to partner with everybody, right? You have to have an open conversation with everybody about what their needs are. And as the manager, you have to understand exactly what it is they're producing and how they're used to doing it. At Spotify, we acquired 5 different production studios all at the same time. And we had to figure out how to integrate 5 different production styles all together. So there was a lot of time. I kind of refer to it vaguely as pre-production. You spend a lot of time talking with everybody and really empathizing and understanding what everybody's trying to do. And only then can you step back and design a workflow or a process or choose the right tools that's going to allow that to happen. And when you're looking at a diverse group of producers like that, you're not going to hit it right every time. You're not going to find one process that has no exception to it, because that's too it's too limiting for everybody. So you have to really pre-think, what is my process? And then you have to do a second sweep and a third sweep and a fourth sweep, where you come back and say, okay, now what is going to break this and how am I going to deal with it? So it's a lot of including everybody as partners from the very beginning in every decision that you make, and then making sure you're thinking about every use case and every use case that's going to break it.
But I also heard in there, buried, it's okay to have exceptions to your rules. You agree?
Definitely.
Right,
you have to, because that's where production lives, is in the exceptions, right? And that's why it's so important, if I may, to have what I find is the most important thing, is to have somebody, a team like Erin's team. I can't believe that Erin's team deals with that much content with 2 people, right? That is the most important thing in a modern content company, is the interface between the process and the people. And that's kind of what I think you do, and what your team does, is make sure that the processes are working. There's a constant two-way communication there. And it blows me away when there are teams that don't have enough of those people. Because like I said, it's about personnel and process, right? So you need to really care and feed that.
Thoughts on that? Like, how's that work?
Well, you mentioned earlier to let the creatives be creative. Like, you need to be clear what your boundaries are and your expectations are, because with 200 suppliers producing content from all over the world, you need to know you need to be very clear about what's going to cost them money and what they can't air, especially if you're doing a quick turnaround show. So you don't have the full hour to do what you want. You need to follow some rules when it comes to television.
Setting boundaries. Cleave, from your perspective, as a creative producer, as a storyteller, how does that approach from management empower you to do your job?
So for me, I think as a person who's the individual contributor, you have to create a cadence of communication for your managers, because they are under pressures that you can't possibly imagine. So for instance, at our company, at any given time for a particular upcoming event, the management team may be updating messaging, they may be updating visuals, and this communications are coming to our managers, but not necessarily, we're not getting all of those granular details, but we may be being asked for information that contributes to those details. And so I feel like you need to make sure that that you've established a communication channel with your manager, be it daily or every 6 hours or whatever it is, that makes that manager comfortable enough to know what's going on, so that when he is asked or she is asked for updates on what you're doing, they don't have to come back to you constantly. There has to be some trust there.
Yeah, I think as a manager, you need to read the room a little bit. What's the producer, what's the designer available to do? Like, how much are you pulling them out of actual work to update you? Just read the room. Dan, let's turn to you here. As we're picking out our technology tools, working with our teams to understand their needs and what's going to put them in a position to succeed, how can technology providers work with us, or how should we look to technology providers for support in terms of partnering?
I think that it's important for us as a technology vendor to offer a full gamut of options. We've touched on a little bit here. There's different styles of production. There's certainly different levels of complexity, levels of budget, levels of scale in terms of the production. And it's important to be able to know where your products meet and not try to force the square peg into the round hole in terms of, forcing the technology on a group that's going to lead to that feeling of, too much technology or the technology not solving the problem. So it's important that we recommend the right tools for the job, make sure at the different levels of job we know where to recommend it, and we kind of talk about boundaries a little bit, where to finally say, no, that's not us, or you should turn to somebody else, or at least us and a partner to get that done. So that's the role we see for ourselves in dealing with customers on that. And I think, we anticipate some sliding scale there, but I think the role of on the production side too is obviously having some of that scale of what you're really asking for. Things get more complex, they suddenly scale back a little bit, those are understood, but within a certain level of a scale.
Chris, this is certainly something you've dealt with, right? Numerous vendors to build out multiple studios. How have you managed those relationships? How have you pulled in your people to provide information and build that partnership back and forth so it's not just...
Yeah, great question. How have I handled it? Probably not as well as some people would have liked, but better than I expected. I think it goes back to, I really like what Dan's saying, because you have to really pre-think all those things and think about what are all of you have to think like an integrator, a systems integrator, and you have to think, what are all the things that I need to do and how am I going to solve it, and what are the few tools that I'm going to place bets on, right? And some companies are they're transient in and out with their technologies, but if you have a company like what I love about LiveU and what Dan does is, they're thinking long term. They've been around for a long time, and so they're building these great technologies technologies that they can continue to integrate more and more. But as Dan said, he doesn't want to be building tools to do everything. For me, I would love, as we said, as few tools as possible, right? So how do you make those two worlds meet? Because when they don't meet, it becomes nightmare. So you need to know pretty much what your plan is going to be and what the exceptions are going to be so you can pre-build and choose the right technologies. We talked about there being too many platforms. We talked about, Cleave talked about Slack. And, the best example I can give you is just in communications in general. When I was at Google, we were all forced to use Google products. So everybody was always on the same channels. You knew that you were either going to use Gmail or GChat, and you can get with anybody anytime. Then when I went to Spotify was a very forward-looking tech company, and they would be like, oh, well, let's have Slack, and let's have GChat, and let's have this. And there was 10 different ways to communicate across the company and with all the teams, and you had to stop and think. The management thought, oh, well, we're being open and we're letting everybody use the technology that suits them and works for them. But what happens is you have to stop and you have to cognitively think, okay, I need to talk to Mark. Does Mark respond to Slack messages or chats, or should I send him an email, or how do I do it? So even the communication, the act of communication itself, you have to pre-think and make your choice about what's the process and how's that going to work so that everybody's on the same page. As long as everybody can communicate and you can get on the same page, you can overcome any obstacle.
What's the role in leadership listening to action, behavior, right? Like if we've got a tool, we're telling everybody to use it, and they're working around it because it's not satisfying their needs, we need to be paying attention. We need to be heads up. Hey, we've got this tool, fill in the blank, and people aren't using it the way we've intended. What are those nonverbal cues, if you will, that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, but that's on me, right? Like if I implement something and people are working around it, that means I didn't do a good job making them a partner. I didn't do a good job understanding their needs. I didn't do a good job understanding what the overall process is going to be and how it's going to integrate. So, and this is why my hat's off to Erin, is you need to not only do that pre-production work and understand that and build to that, but then you need to keep communicating at every delivery, at every moment on an ongoing basis to make sure if somebody starts subverting and going around your tools, that's a sign that maybe you have the wrong tool, or maybe you have to build in some sort. They may have a really good reason for it, right? But instead of being judgmental or being hurt about, oh, they're not doing it as I designed it, you have to say, okay, this is the new world which we live in, and how are we going to deal with that?
I told somebody, a manager last week, it's no longer about you. As a manager or as a leader, it's no longer about you, it's about listening. Dan, you peeked up here when we were talking about this, or when I introduced the question, like, how heads up do managers, leaders need to be about the technology, the solutions, the tools we provide?
I was just thinking that importance of that feedback of the actual utilization. I mean, it is something that, using Slack as an example, it does, right? Like you get that report at the end of the week of how many messages were in rooms, how many were direct, and you can kind of see some insight into behavior through things like that. For us on the live video contribution side, if we see a customer that's way under the hours or gigabytes utilization we expected from that production, we definitely want to check in with them and see what went wrong, what happened, why didn't you ended up not using the gear or using it in a different way. So that kind of utilization feedback reporting of, of course we have thousands of customers, we have some expectation of what you're going to use. Let's look at you and see, did you come in where we expected, and then explore what went wrong, or maybe what went great, and you represent a different utilization pattern than we're used to.
Erin, from your perspective, have your suppliers given you that feedback? How is that coming in? How are you observing what they're providing you?
I would say usually it's us providing feedback and then having that conversation, but building the relationship. So whenever they have a problem, source footage came in wrong, we need to change an air date, we can do that quickly, and we have that trust in the relationship. So yeah, communication both ways, but
active
again,
listening.
If you want to get a show on air, you need to submit it a certain way.
Right, yeah, do it my way. Dan, from your perspective, I want to kind of highlight this point that there's a lot of similarities between traditional broadcasters and corporate content producers. From your perspective, working with both sides of that, like what have you seen? What have your teams seen?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes, especially, I don't want to generalize, but maybe from the broadcast side, there can be this sort of impression of like, well, I'm sure what we're doing in broadcast is more complex than what enterprise is doing. And sometimes it's quite the opposite, right? Like in some ways, broadcast gets held to some technical standards, especially when it comes to over-the-air TV or a very large infrastructure that they have to continue to support for a long period of time, that other producers can work around. Examples would be jumping straight to 1080p. How quickly 1080p became a standard in other worlds besides broadcast compared to broadcast. Like YouTubers were using 1080p 10 years ago and have standardized there. So we see leaps like that where sometimes in some ways broadcast is held back and other producers can race ahead. And certainly there's small productions out there and people using really ingenious ways of using things like podcast tools to do even live broadcast and getting a lot of value out of very low dollar tools. But then there's also producers out there, I'm sure like SalesForce and Spotify and Microsoft that their investment is just as big as broadcast. Their studios are just as sophisticated. They're using just as cutting edge technology, SMPTE 2110, examples like that. And again, in many ways, sometimes are leaping ahead to say, we can do 4K P60 HDR, like looks great, and we don't have an infrastructure we have to be bogged down by and support. So in some ways they're ahead.
Chris, can I ask you about that?
Yes.
When you were designing your facilities, are you looking at traditional broadcasters? Are you looking at what they're not doing? How does that influence your decision making?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of it, right? Like I think the key today is designing production and production flows that you're just not precious about, right? You have to be open to new input and new ways as they come at you, but you also have to design, facilities-wise, places that are capable of handling both, right? It doesn't make sense to build one way or the other anymore. The technology has gotten so kind of close together between corporate and broadcast that, at least for me, and I'm spoiled, I've worked on very high-end studios, so those are big companies. So we had to build from broadcast down to somebody who just picked up their iPhone and is trying to figure out how to make a video. And all of the principles are the same, but the techniques are different. In fact, one of the biggest lessons I ever learned was at YouTube. We had Blumhouse, who's the Jim Blum? Anyway, head of Blumhouse coming and did a thing with YouTubers, and we were trying to figure out how to do 360 video, which was another one of those technologies that nobody else had picked up. And we were sitting there as traditional broadcast producers thinking, oh, how are we going to do this, and where are we going to put the director, and we're going to have a video village. We're trying to solve all these problems in this very complicated way that was very much how we had learned coming up through film school and all of that stuff. And one of the YouTube directors came up and said, well, why don't I just go stand up in the catwalk and direct from there, and I'll just yell down. And it's like, well, of course, that's brilliant. But we're sometimes a little bit too encumbered by our broadcast pasts. You know what I mean? So that's why I always say, don't be too precious. Be open to any solution as it comes, because there are other ways to produce, right? Anything. There are always multiple ways to solve a problem.
Indeed there is. We've got about a minute and a half here. Cleave, when we were pre-gaming, we talked about the concept of having leadership who has a voice at the table, whether that's marketing, whether that's IT operations. How important is that from your perspective? And I think this is going to be our final point here before we have to jump off stage. But when your leadership understands what challenges you've got, and they can voice that at the table with other leaders, and they understand the direction the marketing organization is going, the direction the company is headed, and the strategy, the effort, the amount of what's really at stake. How important is that, to a video production team that in most cases may be the last person to know that a project's coming?
Yeah, it's just really interesting because I've been on both sides of this. I've been the leader, and then I've been the individual contributor. And as an individual contributor, I just want to be unleashed to go make the movie. I just want to make the movie. And for me, I say this to my manager all the time, all I need you to do is just clear a path for me. And so this is what I need. And when we have managers sitting at the table telling us, this is what they need to give you what you want, it's just super important. It focuses everybody's attention on providing only what's necessary to complete the task so we can move forward.
Love it. And we are right on time. That's how it's done, people. Thanks, everybody. Give a great round of applause here to this fantastic group. Thanks for your time. We'll see you around.
Thank you, Mark.